How's everybody doing today? We are live, and today is going to be an introduction to the Caro-Kann course. Let me know who's in the chat. So today we're going to do a lot of Q&A, answer your questions about the Caro-Kann. Let's make it very interactive again. So let me know who's here. Where are you from? Go ahead, type it in the chat. I see ChessGoals is here. Hey, Dave from Houston, welcome. It looked like when we started we had 8 viewers, and then it dropped to 2, and now it's back up to 4. So I'm not sure what happened. If you're just rolling in, let us know where you're from. Jackie from St. Louis, welcome. Also, I'm interested, what is your main defense currently against 1e4? Put that answer in the chat. So what is your main response to e4? Are you a Caro player, Sicilian, e5, French, Scandinavian, modern? Oh, that's interesting, Dave. We always have to reload once the live stream starts to get playback working. Huh. You know, Dave, is that something I need to fix on my end? I use OBS. Or is that just a YouTube thing? Hey, there's Memphis. There's a delivery truck driving by. Okay, so if you're just coming in, let me know where you're from and what do you play against 1e4? What's your main defense? Put that in the chat. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes. We used to do a dog cam all the time. Hey, buddy. So today what we're going to do is we're going to go through 10 different lines from the Caro-Kann, and it's going to be a move-by-move explanation. So every single move, I'm going to explain what we're doing. And this is going to serve as an introduction to the Caro-Kann, but following the ChessGoals repertoire. So we're only going to follow ChessGoals moves for black, but this is going to be a lead-in to, if you want to explore deeper, you can look into the ChessGoals full Caro-Kann course. So what this course can be used as is someone who doesn't play the Caro at all. You can learn the Caro-Kann. And if you already play the Caro-Kann, hopefully this is a nice sort of review or reminder of some of the ideas at the base level of the Caro. And then I'll put this into a free course probably. So today what we'll do is I'll be recording for the course, and then at the end of each variation, we're going to have a Q&A. So throughout we'll do Q&As at the end of each variation, so you guys can ask questions and we can go through things. And then in terms of the lines we're going to look at today, this is based on games of Lichess players rated between 1200 and 1600 classical on Lichess. So the idea is we're going to give you sort of the 10 most common lines at the, I would say, advanced beginner to intermediate level, somewhere in that range, just a little bit lower level than what the main Caro-Kann course is based on. And then the first 3 lines are going to be the advanced variation where white plays c3 on move 4. And then we're going to do 2 more lines of the advanced variation where white doesn't play c3. There's going to be 2 exchange variation lines, 2 Tartakower lines, and then 1 line where white plays knight f3 on move 2. All right, let's look at the chat. Jackie's saying typically the modern and the Pirts. Dave goes 1e5, goes from there. Okay, good. So we have some new Caro-Kann players in the chat. This is awesome. All right, let's jump in to line number 1. Okay, so remember, this is going to be kind of a live recording for the class or for the course that's coming out. So I'll be reading a script, adding a few things as I go. There'll be a full PGN with the course that you guys can download later. This will all be for free. This course will be free. And then at the end of each group of lines, so like the four C3 advance 3 lines, after I finish those 3 lines, we'll do a Q&A on that. And then we'll kind of progress like that as we go. Okay, so here we go. So this course is based on the most popular moves for white at the 1200 to 1600 Lichess classical level at slow time control. So this is classical games. And what I will do in this course is walk you through every move, explaining the ideas behind each move. And after the completion of all of these lines, you'll be on your way to playing the Caro-Kann with confidence. And if you're watching the video, that's K-A-N-N, confidence. All right, here we go. So we have E4, C6. This is the Caro-Kann. C6 makes this the Caro-Kann already. And what we're doing here is we're making a solid claim for the center and preparing to play D5 on the next move. D4, most common move for white. So we're always going to play either the most common move for white, or if we're going on to a new variation, the second most common move, we respond with pawn to D5. So white is grabbing the center here with E4 and D4, but we're immediately challenging the center with our pawn on D5, and it's supported by the pawn on C6. So this is a very solid setup for us. Pawn to E5, most common move. This is called the advanced variation. So white's pushing their pawn forward, and they're claiming more space. Now, how do we know white has more space here? Look at the squares behind the pawns. So white has all this room behind the pawns. And if you look at our position, we're a little bit cramped back here, right? We don't have as much space yet. So E5 logically makes a lot of sense. White's grabbing this extra space. But now what we're going to do is use these advanced pawns and try to challenge them, try to create weaknesses in white's pawn structure. So now we play pawn to C5. This is, in my opinion, the best way to fight back. But you will note, if you look at other Caro-Kann games, resources, bishop to F5 is very popular here as well. And it's probably the most popular move, but C5, Engine approves of it, and it's been gaining popularity in the last few years. So this is our recommendation at ChessGoals, pawn to C5. And the reason I like this is we're immediately fighting against the pawn on D4. So we're attacking the base of white's pawn chain. This is white's pawn chain. The base is the pawn that's furthest back, so it's kind of closest to white's first rank. We're attacking the base of the pawn chain. Now, at this moment, the strongest moves, according to the computer and grandmasters, are knight F3 and d takes C5. Those are the best ways for white to fight for a small advantage. And the higher your rating is, the more important it is to fight for those tiny advantages out of the opening. But the lower your rating goes, the less experienced you are, the more likely you're going to see pawn to C3. And at the club level, C3 is the most popular move. So even for players like 15, 1600, C3 is the most popular move. It's not until you start pushing 18, 1900 that you'll see less players playing C3 than the other options. So pawn to C3, a solid move, and this just creates a really long pawn chain. It makes sense to play C3, and it's not a bad move. It just doesn't fight for the advantage as much as other moves. So now we play knight to C6, and we're going to talk about what happens if white takes later. So you might be wondering, isn't that a free pawn? We'll talk about it. Knight C6, developing the knight to the natural square and adding an additional attacker on this D4 pawn. So see how we have 2 attackers? White has 2 defenders. That's very important in these lines. When we see the advanced variation with C3 for white, the whole game is going to be centered around this pawn on D4. That's our goal. Make it so white has to play defense and we're going to play offense. We're going to play for the initiative. Knight to F3 by white. White develops the knight, defends this pawn, gets a little bit closer to castling. Now we play C takes D4. So we're trading a set of pawns. We're opening up this C file, which our rook can use later. Also, notice what we did. We took away the pawn that was defending the other pawn, right? So now this pawn on d4 is not defended by a pawn. So here it becomes a game of, can we attack this pawn with our pieces and annoy white and make a situation where it's difficult for white to use their pieces to defend the pawn. Okay, so white recaptured. Now we play bishop to g4. And the engine's already saying 0.00. So this game is completely equal. White has no advantage out of the opening. But when you look at databases of human versus human play, black scores really well in this position already. And here's the reason why. The knight on f3 is pinned down to the queen. Both the knight and the queen are trying to defend the weak pawn on d4. So you can already feel the pressure from white's point of view. White's trying to defend this pawn on d4, but all the pieces are kind of getting tied down. So what we're doing here is we're developing the bishop, pinning the knight, and we're preparing to play e6 next, creating our own solid pawn chain. We'll have no weaknesses, and we're going to focus on attacking the d4 pawn. Okay, bishop to e2 by white, developing, breaking this pin, and now we play pawn to e6. So this is technically our bad bishop, and it's the bad bishop because it's the same color as our pawns. What we did is we got the bishop outside of the pawn chain. So if that bishop were sitting back on c8, that's inside of the pawn chain because it would be trapped behind these pawns. So picture this bishop back here. It's stuck, right? It'd be a bad bishop trapped inside the pawn chain. But now it's outside the pawn chain. So it's a bad bishop, but it's an active bishop. Okay, so now the bishop's outside the pawn chain. We played e6, solidified the center. Now we're ready to get our kingside pieces out. Castle by white. Knight g to e7. And the reason we moved the knight before the bishop is we want this knight to move again, and then the bishop probably lands on e7. If we did the bishop first, then it's actually hard to figure out where do we put that g8 knight because we're lacking a little bit of space here in the center. So knight g to e7, pawn to h3 by white. White asks the question to our active bishop, what are you going to do? Are you going to trade or are you going to retreat? This is a small mistake for white, but it's the most common move. So that's one thing I like about this repertoire as well, is there's a lot of traps and common moves that aren't good for white. So we can take advantage of those moves. h3 hits our bishop. The strongest move by quite a bit is to capture on f3. And now we have a clear advantage. We're trading bishop for knight. This does give white the bishop pair, meaning white's going to have two bishops to r1. That's called the bishop pair. And the bishop pair can be worth up to half a pawn, but that tends to be in open positions, right? All things considered, all things equal, bishop pair can be worth half a pawn, but here we have a closed position, meaning these pawns are all locked up in the center, and we have a huge weakness for white. So that bishop pair doesn't matter at all in the current position. So now after bishop takes f3, we play queen to b6. Let's count the attackers on d4. 2 attackers for us. Let's count the defenders. 1 defender. Okay. So now white's in a tough position. How do they defend that d4 pawn in extra time? The only way that really makes sense, and it's the strongest move, is to play bishop to e3. White does not want to lose this pawn. That's an important center pawn, and if that pawn goes away, our pawn on d5 becomes a protected pass pawn. So picture this pawn off the board. That pawn on d5 is really strong. There's no pawns to stop it for white, and it's already defended by one of our pawns. So white defends, but the problem with this is that bishop had a job. It was guarding b2, which our queen attacks. So white did not have a way to protect both of these pawns. White has to give up a pawn. And remember, this is the most common moves for white. You're going to see this position all the time. So bishop e3, queen takes b2, winning material, threatening to win the rook. Knight to d2 by white. And now white's ready to counterattack rook b1, hitting our queen, maybe trying to come down into our position. But that's okay. We can play knight to f5, creating a third attacker on this pawn. So we're just improving our pieces, getting developed. We look to play for the initiative. We keep attacking. We keep white playing defense. And we have a third attacker on the pawn. Rook to b1 hitting our queen. Here we can grab a second pawn. Queen takes a2. And the position is sharp, but I'm going to show you guys in just another move an easy way to navigate this position and get to safety. Rook takes b7, winning one pawn back, so we're still up one pawn. And white's rook is active on our 7th rank. But here there's an excellent move, and it just calms everything down. Bishop to b4. So here we're looking to simplify. We have a clear advantage, and we're threatening knight takes e3, followed by winning this knight. So notice how we have two attackers, and we're also ready to castle. And then in the end, we have this passed a pawn ready to march up the board, backed up by our rook on a8. So this is line number 1. This is the most common line. Caro-Kann advanced variation 4c3. It's the most common line you're going to see. Okay, let's go into line number 2 now. This is also 4c3, but it's going to be a different move order for white. So we'll start with the same moves. And this is the exact same position that we had in chapter number 1. And now we're going to look at a new idea for white. Bishop to b5, pinning the knight to our king. You'll see this move quite often. It's the second most popular move here. And what we're going to do is we're going to play pawn to e6 first. Create this pawn chain. We're still going to focus on this weakest pawn on the board, the pawn on d4. Castle by white. And now we can play knight to e7. So our development plan stays the same. That's something that we aim for in this ChessGoals course, consistency. We want to make it easy for you guys to figure out the next moves. Knight to e7, defending this knight. It's going to head to f5 later, most likely. Bishop to g5 by white. Notice what white's doing. They're playing very actively with their bishops. There's 2 pins on the board. And now we can play queen to b6. So similar to chapter 1, queen comes out to b6, pressures this pawn, and it's attacking this bishop on b5. Also, it unpins the knight on e7, so really strong square for the queen. Queen out to b6. Knight to c3 by white, defending their bishop. But notice what's happening here. White is sort of neglecting the pawn on d4. The pawn on d4 has 2 pieces attacking it currently, and 2 defenders. But one of the defenders is attacked and pinned to the queen. So you can already tell this position is getting shaky for white. Here we can play knight to f5, jumping to that powerful square, creating another attacker on d4. Bishop takes c6 by white, trying to remove one of our attackers, which was pinned to the king. And now we can play b takes c6. The nice thing about b takes c6 is we're bringing this pawn towards the center. And when we bring that pawn towards the center, we can use this pawn potentially in the future to attack the pawn on d4 as well. So extra center pawns are valuable. Now bishop e3, most common move, trying to defend. We develop our last minor piece. Most common move is h3, trying to put the question to this bishop. And here again we go bishop takes f3. So staying consistent, just like in the first chapter. White challenges our bishop. We trade it for the knight. And we're only trading it for the knight when we feel that we can cash in on this advantage with the weak pawn on d4. So we feel now we can cash in here. We take the knight. Queen takes f3. And if you go knight takes d4 here, you do have to be really careful because of this pin. White could play, for example, queen g4, double attack. So you don't want to take that pawn right here. You can play queen takes b2 though. And we're just taking advantage of how white's pieces are disorganized. There was no piece to guard b2. There's no pawn on b7. So, for example, rook b1, rook takes b7 is not happening in this line. And also the pawn, or the knight, excuse me, on c3 is attacked. So we won the b2 pawn. We're going to castle. We're going to play c5. And what that's going to do is it's going to offer a trade of the d4 pawn for the c6 pawn. And then in the end, we get the protected pass pawn on d5. So this is a really big advantage already. If you had a computer against a computer or a grandmaster against a grandmaster, black is going to win this most of the time. It's that big of an advantage already. One pawn, it's going to be a protected pass pawn pretty soon, and no weaknesses for black. Okay, so that's line number 2. We've seen 2 really strong lines for black, and this is based on the most common moves that white's going to play. Let's go to our third and final line with the advanced 4c3, and then we'll do a Q&A on these first 3 lines. Okay, e4, c6. Same setup. And now we're looking at an even earlier pin. You'll find that your opponents really like to pin this c6 knight. It's just a natural looking move. You see a pin, you go for it. You develop that bishop, which helps you castle quicker. So white plays bishop to b5 here on move 5. And now we have a very active response. I like this move a lot. Queen to a5. We immediately challenge this bishop, and there's no knight to c3 here to defend the bishop. So now the strongest move for white is bishop takes c6 check, and we capture back towards the center again. This is creating this strong central pawn mass. So picture this pawn trading on d4. What would happen there is these c pawns would both be gone, and then we have this extra c pawn. So just like in the last line, that extra c pawn could advance later to attack the future base of white's pawn chain. So this is already kind of a nice pawn structure for us. Bishop to d2 by white. Eyeing our queen, so we can drop her back to b6, the queen's favorite square. Pressuring d4, pressuring b2. Pawn to b3 by white. C takes d4. C takes d4. And after the trades, the center is opening up a bit, but look what's happening. This pawn on d4 is unprotected. So let me back that up a couple moves. We put the queen on b6, and we had 2 threats. How does white guard b2, and how does white defend us winning a pawn on d4? Probably the best move is queen to c2 here, but that's not very common, and that's not what we're covering in this line, just because you're not seeing it as often. If white plays queen c2, you could develop solidly with e6, and you still have a clear advantage. But b3 here allows us to win this pawn. Takes, takes, and now queen takes d4. Bishop to c3, most common move. And here, we can simplify going for the queen trade. Takes, takes. White captures with their king, meaning they can no longer castle. Now we play the solid pawn move, e6. And here's our plan. We're going to go knight to e7. Head that knight probably out to g6 to pressure this new weakness. And then we'll play pawn to c5, bishop to d7, and we're going to try to use our extra pawn in the middle to convert this to a win. This is a 2.5 pawn stockfish advantage, which is a massive advantage and should be winning, I would say 90% of the time or more for you guys. This is a really big advantage. Okay, so that's line number 3. Let's open it up to questions in the chat. What do you guys think so far of this advanced variation with 4c3? Do you have any questions on these lines? And next, we're going to look at what happens if white doesn't play c3 here. And the cool thing with the c3 lines is it's just so natural for white to play c3, but I think really black's having all of the fun. As soon as I see 4c3, I get really excited, just knowing that I'm going to pressure the d4 pawn long term. Chess Leveling says, thanks for teaching us, coach. You're welcome. I'm going to come out with more and more Caro-Kann content. Okay, Andrew, yeah, been great so far. This is my first opening I'm learning. Awesome. And I'm hoping to do an introduction to the dynamic Slav. So look forward to that. And I want to do an introduction to playing 1e4 for white. So we'll have sort of 3 intro courses for openings, and they'll align with other ChessGoals courses when you guys are ready to go deeper. So that's my plan. We'll have 1e4 for white, We'll have the Caro-Kann and the Dynamic Slav for black. All intro courses. Okay, it looks like no questions, so let's jump into the next line. Dennis is saying Caro-Kann rules. Hey, Dennis, welcome. All right, so we're going to start out again. Caro-Kann, advanced variation, 3c5. And now let's look at knight to f3 by white. So white develops the knight instead of playing pawn to c3. It looks less solid, but this might actually be the strongest move. I've been seeing more and more of this move recently, and it's a trendy move among grandmasters. And I think it's because white's looking to play for a dynamic advantage. White has a little extra space, and they want some dynamic play here. So we're going to play c takes d4. And the reason we do that is because when we take d4, that leaves us with the strong pawn on d5, and white has a weak pawn on e5. So in terms of the pawn structure, this doesn't make sense for white, right? White's giving us a better pawn structure, but what white's gaining is more dynamic piece play. So now knight takes d4, and you'll see queen takes d4 played in grandmaster games quite a bit. Knight takes d4, so notice how white has a strong knight instead of having the pawn on d4. So it's more active piece play, but not as good of a pawn structure for white. Now we play knight to c6, threatening this pawn and offering the knight trade. Most common move, bishop to b5, pinning our knight and creating this double attack. Bishop to d7. And now here, white has to decide, okay, what do we do with this tension? Because if they just do a nothing move, like let's say castle, we can try to grab this pawn on e5 for free. Okay, so white most commonly plays bishop takes c6. We're going to strengthen our center with b takes c6 back, castle. Now we play e6. So one thing you might be thinking in this position is, doesn't that bishop on d7 look like a bad bishop? And you'd be correct. That's a bad bishop currently. The bishop is trapped behind all of these pawns. But we have a plan going forward. We're going to play c5, and that's going to open this bishop up. Once we play c5, that bishop can head to c6, get on this long diagonal, maybe come out to b5, get on this diagonal, and we'll have the big pawn center. And we're going to try to push those pawns up the board to gain an advantage. It's actually already a small advantage here for black. Okay, so pawn to e6, knight to c3 by white. Now we play pawn to c5, kicking this white knight away from the center and gaining extra space. Knight back to f3, knight to e7. So white's knight was retreating. Our knight's coming out to more active square. You can kind of feel this momentum is going in our favor. Bishop to g5. White goes for another pin, develops their last minor piece. And now we can play h6. And what I like about this move is it's kind of sneaky. There are general principles in chess, but every rule or principle in chess has its exceptions. So one thing that we learn in chess is that you want to keep your king safe and you want to castle early. We haven't done that in this line. We're 11 moves in. We're not even close to castling yet. But the center is so solid, right? These pawns are really solid. White has this pawn on e5 that kind of protects our king in a way. It's not easy for white to attack our king here. This h6 move is sneaky because we're about to push our kingside pawns up. Even though we're taught sometimes don't push those pawns up the board in front of where your king's supposed to be, don't delay castling too long. In this line, we can delay castling and we can push those pawns because we're going to create a kingside attack. Bishop to h4, we can play pawn to g5. Kicking that bishop again, it has to go back to g3. And now we go knight to f5. So we're playing a very energetic Caro-Kann, right? Instead of just playing a passive, solid Caro-Kann, that's what a lot of people think of. In the ChessGoals Caro-Kann repertoire, we look to play actively. We look for dynamic play. We want the initiative. We want to create weaknesses in white's camp. We want to make it uncomfortable for the opponents. That's what we're doing here. So the knight goes to this f5 square, which is just perfect. It can trade that bishop on g3 at any time. And the knight from f5, look at all the squares it controls in white's camp. Super active knight. Now our bishops are ready to come out. So this is kind of the plan going forward. Bishop to c6, put the bishop on this long diagonal, knowing that this pawn could always push up and free the bishop. And then we want to play pawn to h5, which threatens to trap white's bishop with pawn to h4, pawn to d4, opening the bishop. And we're just going to keep our king in the center because we have this rook on h8 that actually helps with the attack. This rook on a8 can come to the b file. Just really nice position. All of our pieces are pretty well placed. We have the attack, and the computer is saying this is about a -2 eval. So pretty much a winning position. If it was computer against computer, that -2 threshold is probably winning already with best play, which is just crazy because we're only 13 moves in. All natural looking moves for white so far. It doesn't look like they did anything too bad, but we had this nice idea, h6, g5, and now we have this huge attack, and white doesn't have any counterplay. All right, let's now go to chapter number 5. So again, advanced variation, 3c5. Now we'll look at d takes c5. This historically has been the top move at the grandmaster level. Knight f3 has been gaining popularity, but this is still, I think, probably the best way for white to push for an advantage. Now we can play e6, create this solid center, and the idea is these two pawns for white, let me highlight them in blue, are going to be targets. The pawn on c5 we should be able to win at some point, but the pawn on e5 is also a weakness that white has to think about. Okay, bishop to e3, and now we can play, this guards the pawn, now we can play knight to d7, attacking both pawns. And here, the natural move for white is bishop to b5. Pinning our knight, the knight was attacking the two pawns at the same time. But now we have a nice trick. This is the queen check again that also helps us develop. Queen to a5 check. Because you look at this position, we have all of these pieces on the 8th rank. The knight looks a little clumsy on the 7th rank. It seems like we're congested here. Queen to a5 is a really nice move to help clarify how we're going to develop the minor pieces. Queen a5 forks the bishop and the king. So white's only move is knight c3, blocking the check guard and the bishop. And now we play a6. And there's only one good move for white here. Retreating the bishop actually gives black an advantage. So if this bishop went back somewhere, we can play bishop takes c5, get our pawn back. There's still a weak pawn. We have the advantage here. Strong pawn on d5. So the best move for white is bishop takes d7 check. But now we take back. And every time you can get a trade of these minor pieces when your position is cramped, that's going to help you, right? Because we have the pawn structure advantage. White has the minor piece advantage. Let's go back a couple, right? Notice how white's minor pieces here, they're all better placed than any of our minor pieces. So if we can trade off minor pieces and keep the pawn structure advantage, then we're going to have the advantage overall in terms of the eval because white doesn't have anything in compensation for our better pawn structure. So white takes, we take back, that helps us, but it was white's strongest move. Queen to d4, most common move, but this is a bit of a mistake. White's trying to hold all of these pawns and also looking to maybe play pawn to b4. Using a pawn to guard a pawn always makes sense. Here we can allow that. Knight to e7. What we're going to do is we're going to bring this knight to a light square next and attack the dark squares in white's camp. We don't care that white's holding the pawn for now, because what we want to do is we want to put white in a position where all of their pieces are playing defense. We want white to be playing passively. And notice how that bishop is the bad bishop color because it's on the same color as these pawns. So that's already a defensive bishop. We have the bishop pair. And we're going to try to just keep white playing defense here. Pawn to b4. And now we drop the queen back to c7. So all we're doing here is we're sidestepping and we put the queen on a safe square, and it's also a useful square. Pressuring here, putting some pressure down the c file. Knight to f3 by white. And white's position optically looks pretty good. White has space. Pieces are all developed, but the eval here is minus 0.7. We are almost up a full pawn, even though we're down a pawn, because the white position is shaky. These pawns are hard to defend. The white pieces will be playing defense, trying to guard the pawns. And even though we look passive currently, our position's about ready to explode, right? Once our pieces start flying out, the tactics are going to favor us because our pawn structure is so solid. The pawn structure is really critical here. And I'm planning on coming out with more content on just Caro-Kann pawn structures because the Caro has so many different interesting structures. And I think a lot of the pawn structures do favor black, but you just have to get through the opening moves where your pieces are a bit passive. So that's exactly what's happening here. So now we have a super strong move. Pawn to a5, undermining this mini pawn chain that white has. And we're going to get some counterplay on the queenside pawns. So here are the most common move for white, and this is kind of interesting. If you play it, for example, capture here, knight to f5, this position is completely falling apart for white. Queen's attacked, this pawn's getting captured right away, this pawn's going to die, this bishop's ready to open up, knight's loose. This is a -2 already. So the most common move for white is actually pawn to g4. And it looks funny, but it's trying to prevent us from getting our knight to the natural square. So white's doing a good job here trying to keep our pieces tied up. These are all 8th and 7th rank. But the problem is, look at these pawns for white. Look at the undefended knights. Look at the airy king. There's a lot of weaknesses in white's camp here. And the eval's -1 because of all of that. So pawn structure is key. So instead of knight to f5, we play knight to g6 here, putting the pressure on the e5 pawn. Rook to b1 by white, most common move. And now this last move, I think is really cool. You could play bishop e7, that's a good move too. But you can play pawn to h5 here. We're fighting fire with fire. So we're saying, okay, this position is shaky for white. Let's blow it open, right? We just improved the knight. This rook is now becoming active after we played a5. This rook is becoming active now after we play h5. And we have a huge advantage, a 1-point advantage, just due to all the weaknesses in white's camp. So if you want to try to find a good move here for white, go ahead. h3, for example. You could take g4. The h-pawn is pinned. If white takes here, we actually take back, just leaving our king in the center. He's nice and safe. And that's another attacker on the e-pawn, also eyeing white's camp on the king side. If white pushes past, for example, we can take on b4, opening up this rook. If rook takes b4, rook to a5 is a super strong move, third attacker, and this is a -3 advantage. So white's position is completely falling apart here. So Caro-Kann Advance, that's 5 chapters. We're covering all the main lines there. Let's open it up again to questions. You guys have any questions on the Caro Advance? So Lee is saying earlier, instead of c takes d4, bishop g4, freeing the bishop. Yeah, so I'm trying to think which line this was. Are you looking right here, Lee? Bishop to g4 on this move? That's a good move too. But we're okay in this line with allowing that bishop to be passive because what we're doing is we're taking on d4 before white plays c3. So if you play bishop to g4, for example, here, white could play c3, and white could also play d takes c5, which I think is the strongest line for white. So we're kind of avoiding those lines. We're not allowing white to play c3 later or d takes c5. We're clarifying this tension first so that white doesn't have a chance to go into those better structures. I think, you could say that they're about equivalent, but that's why we're playing c takes d4 first. Okay, Chess Leveling is saying, I'm 900 ELO. Recently learned a few lines for the Caro-Kann, but I struggle with the middle game plan. Any tips? So Chess Leveling, we have a Caro-Kann middle games course at ChessGoals. That's my recommendation. Otherwise, On the ChessGoals YouTube channel, we have playlists, and you can look at our Caro-Kann playlists and just go through sample games. So if you want a curated list of games that follow exactly through the course, chessgoals.com, we have a Caro-Kann middle games course. If you want just free content that also has sample games, look at our playlist on the YouTube channel. Okay, I don't see any other questions. Let's go to the exchange variation. So right here on move number 3, we're looking at e takes d5. Oh, a Panov question. Okay, we actually won't be covering the Panov today, but maybe at the very end we could look at that. So e takes d5. Let me back up again. e4, c6, d4, d5. E takes d5. Second most common move, c takes d5. This is the exchange variation. So white's trading the pawn on d5. And this is going to lead to a more open position and also a quieter position. And our goal is to use the solid pawn structure to create some winning chances. Knight to f3. Many beginners will start with knight to c3 and then play knight to f3 next, which should transpose into this line we're going to show. Knight c6, natural developing move. Knight c3. And now bishop to g4. So similar to that question we had earlier, getting this bishop outside of the pawn chain, and then we're going to play pawn to e6 in the future. So it's a bad bishop technically, but now it's active and it's outside the pawn chain. Bishop e2, e6, solid development, castle, and now we tuck this bishop on d6. So notice how these pawns work really well with that bishop. The pawns kind of guard the light squares around the dark square bishop. So he's nice and safe, and he points towards the white king. h3 by white. Now here, we don't want to capture on f3. It's not a terrible move, and it's still a slight advantage for black. But the reason we don't want to capture on f3 here is because after queen to b6, it's actually okay for white to just play super actively and create some issues for our king. Like we can't get away with taking here because a bishop takes d5, for example. So in the exchange variation, we're going to tend to drop this bishop back always. We don't have that same pressure necessarily that we had in the advanced variation. We're going to just drop the bishop back. And this keeps the pressure on. Knight to b5 by white, most common move. But here we have a cool move. And this is something that grandmasters do all the time. When knights attack your bishops, look to retreat the bishop even if it's all the way back on your very first rank, and then kick the knight out later. So we put the bishop back on b8, still pointing at that h2 square, and then later we'll kick the white knight away. c3. Now we play a6. The knight has to go back to the edge of the board. So white did create this solid pawn chain, but the knight had to go back to the edge. And now we play knight f6, developing. Rook e1, and castle. So we're not getting that same play that we saw in the advanced variation in terms of weak pawn on d4, attack, attack, attack. And there's no e5 pawn for white. But the difference here is we have a really solid position, and we have a long-term plan called the minority attack. So the minority attack is when you have 2 pawns on the queen side, and white has 3, and you use your 2 pawns to start pushing up the board, and you try to trade off some of your pawns on the queen side for some of white's pawns. So let's just say these 2 pawns traded for these 2 pawns. Hypothetical. That leaves the 1 pawn on c3 for white. That's a target. Right? That pawn is a backward pawn, and it's on a half-open file that we can attack it. That's a simple plan. It's called the minority attack. You also have another nice plan here. You could play on the king side. Knight to e4, followed by pawn to f5. And now you're starting to create a king side attack. You've anchored your knight on this active square. You have the bishop pointing this way. You have this other bishop here. Pawn up on f5. Your queen's looking over here. That's another way you could play this. For example, Queen coming to d6 is already maybe threatening bishop takes f3 and queen h2 check in some lines. White has to be very careful. So a couple of good plans here. Nice solid position. Eval is about half a pawn for black. So nice advantage as well. That's the exchange variation, part 1. And now let's look at one other exchange line. Takes, takes. Same position. Now let's look at an early pin. So remember, white loves these early pins, especially the lower your rating is. So at the advanced beginner, intermediate level, you're going to see a lot of players pinning this knight early, even if it's not always quite the strongest move. So like here, eval at this position is about 0.2 for white, just a really slight, tiny advantage. White moves first. Not a lot is going on in the position. This goes from 0.2 to 0.0. So it's not a terrible move, but a lot of times when you see white do this early bishop to b5 in these Caro lines, it's giving up that chance for white to really try to squeak out the biggest advantage possible. So white's kind of giving up that advantage already on move 5. The advantage of having the white pieces, I should say. Queen a5 check. So again, same idea, we're keeping consistent. The knight blocks with knight to c3. And now we play bishop to g4, pinning this knight. And again, the d4 pawn is becoming one of the key factors in the position. White's trying to hold that d4 pawn, and we're trying to add pressure. You'll hear me talk about pressure all the time, especially in the full course. Pressure, pressure, pressure. We always look to pressure our opponents. That makes it more difficult for them to find good moves, and that makes them more likely to make mistakes. So I always talk about having the initiative in the position, which means you're dictating the action, playing actively, making your opponent play defense, adding pressure to the opponent, giving your opponent tough decisions. These are all the things that we want to do in these openings. All right, so now we pin the bishop on, pin the knight on f3. Bishop takes c6, most common move. We take back with the b pawn. And white did relieve a little bit of pressure here, but look what we did again. We recaptured with our pawn towards the center. So this strengthens our pawn structure. Castle by white. We play the solid move e6, h3. Now here capturing is an okay move, but I'm recommending we drop our bishop back. If there's not a great reason to capture on f3, I always recommend dropping the bishop back. Having the bishop pair is valuable. And this bishop is outside the pawn chain. It's a good bishop. Queen to d3. This is breaking the pin, but still keeping the knight defended so that if we capture, the queen can always capture back. Bishop to d6, tucking the bishop inside the pawns. Nice cozy spot, points at h2. Knight back to e2. Queen c7. So what we're doing is we're just continuing to put our pieces on good squares. Right? Develop all of your pieces to good squares, create a flexible setup. Eventually, we may play c5 or we may go for e5, which is most likely even stronger, and I'm going to show you why. On to b3, most common move for white. What they're trying to do here is get the bishop on the fianchetto square, I think. Bishop g5 doesn't make a lot of sense, because that bishop is just sort of sitting out in space. Bishop e3 is kind of a weak square between these two pawns. Bishop d2 looks passive. So b3, we're trying to fianchetto. Now we can go knight e7. You might be wondering, why don't we put the knight on f6? Knight f6 is the natural square for black, right? Put the knight on f6, controls more squares. e7 feels passive. So why e7? We put the knight on e7 in this position because of the pawn structure. Pawn structure is really important, and it can help you figure out a plan. The knight on e7 is allowing us to play f6, e5 later. If you play f6 and e5 with the c pawn back on b7, let's say, that's a bit shaky. And the reason that's shaky is because the pawn on d5 will become weak. Right? So picture these two pawns pushing up. That d pawn doesn't have any pawns to defend it. But because we brought this pawn to the center, The C pawn guards the D pawn, so we can push these guys up and make a really big center. Our E pawn's guarded by F6, our D pawn's guarded by C6. It's just this massive center, and the E pawn's ready to come up to E4, creating a fork. The pawns are what's giving us the advantage here. So we're finally able to use our pawn structure for an advantage, whereas in some of the other lines we've seen, it takes a lot longer, right? We have the better pawn structure, but it takes longer to realize that advantage. Here, we're already looking to push those pawns up the board. Bishop B2, castle, and here's the plan. F6, bishop F7, knight G6, pawn to E5. So in the end, our pawn structure looks like this, and our knight's out on G6, bishop's tucked back, super solid position. And if you're having trouble picturing it, let me just give white some random moves, just so that we can see the black setup. This is kind of what we want in the end, right? All of our pieces are on good squares, no weaknesses, and we control the center, and we're pushing forward with those center pawns. Okay, so that's our 2 chapters on the exchange. Let's open it up to questions again in the YouTube chat. Okay, I see a couple other comments. Let's see, Chess Simple is saying, maybe Matt will cover it quickly at the end. Yeah, okay, we're talking about the Panov. And we'll talk about the Panov once we're done. So once we finish the 10th line, we just did line number 7. Once we finish the 10th line, we'll do a big Q&A. Any questions? Okay. Let's take about a 60-second break. So if you guys want to go get a refill of your coffee, get a snack, get a beverage, let's do a 60-second break, and then we'll come right back. We'll do the last 3 lines, and we'll do a big Q&A at the end where we can look at the Panov or just nerd out on the Caro-Kann. Okay, so 60-second break. I'll be right back. You guys, come right back in 60 seconds. All right, Dennis is saying more coffee. Harsha's saying, is this for free? Your teaching style is captivating. Yeah. So we do have a Caro-Kann course that you can purchase, chessgoals.com. This intro course is free, and I think if your rating is at the beginner level, or maybe you're kind of an advanced beginner, this is all you need to start with. And then as you are ready to get more into the Caro-Kann, you could purchase the full Caro-Kann course that we have. All right, let's go to the next line. The Tartakower. I really enjoy the Tartakower opening. So this is E4, C6, D4, D5. knight to c3. So when you see knight to c3, this is called the classical variation. This will also work when white plays knight to d2. So either knight to c3 or knight to d2, they will both lead to the same position coming up. Because what we're going to do is we're going to capture. No matter which square the knight's on, white's most likely to capture back. Now here, let's just look at the imbalances in this position before going any deeper. White has the extra space in the center, right? They have this advanced pawn. They have the knight sitting in the center. We have kind of a passive position. We just have the pawn back on c6. But that's okay, because what's going to happen is we're going to look to develop our pieces very actively here. So in this line, we're not going for the better pawn structure. We're actually going for the active pieces. So we're going to play knight to f6. And this is a big branching point in the Caro-Kann. So if you see the classical variation, that's what we're looking at right here. There are 3 main moves here. And I've played all of them in my chess career. Knight to d7. And the idea there is this knight is either coming to f6 or it's backing up its buddy with the other knight going to f6. It's a little bit tough to play this line, though. There are a lot of attacking variations for white that you have to learn. So I'm not in love with that line anymore. Bishop to f5 is also very common. This move has been the strongest historically, but there's some downsides to that too. That bishop is kind of floating out there in space, and it's easy for white to attack it. For example, knight g3, bishop back, h4 starts to harass the bishop very early in the opening. So there's downsides to all 3 of the moves, but the third move, and my favorite move, actually gives white the advantage in terms of the pawn structure, but it gives us a lot of dynamic play. We have some compensation for this pawn structure, and this is becoming more and more popular at the top levels, and the engine definitely approves of it now. Whereas like 5 years ago, or maybe even back 10 years ago, computers weren't as strong. They didn't think this move was very good. Grandmasters didn't think it was that great either. But knight to f6 is our recommendation. It's a perfectly good move, and this is called the Tartakower variation. Knight takes f6 check. Almost everybody plays this. And the reason why is it forces us to double our pawns. We're going to play e takes f6. If you took all the pieces off the board and just had the pawns here, white has a big advantage, because this extra f-pawn won't really help us much, and white has 4 queenside pawns to r3. But when you look at the eval, it's very close to equal. We're looking at like a plus 0.2 or a 0.3 for white, the same as all the other lines. But this one, we get some dynamic play with the pawns. Knight to f3. And what we're going to do here is the same setup every time in the Tartakower. We're going to play bishop d6. We're going to castle. We're going to put our rook on e8. And we're going to bring the knight over to f8. This is so easy to play. You can blitz out your first 10 moves almost every game when you face the Tartakower. Bishop to c4. We castle. Castle. Rook to e8. We put our rook on the open file, and we open up this line for our knight. And what we're going to do is we're going to use our extra kingside pawn to help control the center and potentially launch a kingside attack. So when you have 2 f-pawns, one f-pawn can keep the king safe, and the other f-pawn can either launch up the board itself for an attack, or it could support the g-pawn coming for an attack. But it also has a strong purpose where it just defends squares that white's pieces want to go to. Right? So there's a lot of advantages to having these double pawns, even though on average, double pawns are known to be weak, right? As beginners, we're all taught, don't double your pawns. Well, these double pawns have some advantages, but they also have some disadvantages, but they actually even out. So they're not a weakness overall. Rook to e1, knight to d7. And now here, most common move is to trade rooks. We take back. And you will find that there's a lot of opponents that will try to just trade everything down in these lines. They know they have the better pawn structure and they'll just go trade, 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 try to trade everything off. So if white plays queen e1 here, for example, offering the queen trade, I would put our queen back on d8 and say, no queen trade for you. We want to keep that dynamic play, knowing that we can't trade off all the pieces. But the most common move here is bishop to e3. Now we play knight f8. Knight continues on its journey. The most common move here is actually d5, and it's the same philosophy for white. They're thinking, let's just trade off. These trades will take us to an endgame where we're sort of up a pawn on the queen side. It may be close to a winning position. But here we have a really nice move. Pawn to c5. We just lock up this pawn on d5, and we're going to play around it. So white tried to open the center, but we shut the door. Pawn to c5. Position's extremely solid. The position is also balanced. So all things considered, this position is equal. And here's our plan. The knight will go to g6, and then probably up to e5. Put the bishop on d7, and then we have two options. This is where the fun comes in. We can push on the queen side, pawn to b5, look at these pawns, or we could push on the king side, g5, f5, h5. These are all options. So white has this strong pawn in the middle, the pawn on d5, but we work around it in both directions. Queen side pawns push, king side pawns push, and the pawn on d5 is currently stuck. So this is kind of what you get in the Tartakower. You get very dynamic positions where it almost makes you play on the edge of your seat, because you know that you don't want to trade off all the pieces and go into the endgame. But you're going to get a lot of really fun positions where you can use your pawns to attack, and you can create kingside attacks. And your opponent is actually the one playing defense, and they're just really tying all their hopes to that endgame where they're up a pawn. Where they're up a pawn, I should say, on the queen side. They're not actually up a pawn. And the more and more Tartakower games you play, you will get very comfortable in these positions, and they will end up being positions where you're more comfortable than your opponent. Just think about it this way. If you're playing the Caro all the time, and over half of your opponents play 1e4, you're going to get quite a few Tartakower games. Your opponents who are e4 players only face the Caro a certain percentage of the time, and then when they play the classical, they only face the Tartakower a certain percentage of the time. So they're going to be much less versed in these positions than you. That's kind of the hope. It's an equal position, and it's dynamic, and you guys just get really good at knowing the plans. Okay, one more Tartakower line to look at. So Caro-Kann, classical, Tartakower, Tartakower accepted. Same initial moves. And now let's look at bishop to d3. This is equally as common as bishop to c4. Developing the bishop, getting ready to castle. So we both castle, and our plan doesn't change. That's the beauty of this Tartakower recommendation. Castle, rook e8, same move order. White plays c3, and we go knight d7 again. Queen to c2 did create this threat on h7, so we brought our knight to f8. Same exact plan. Knight defends the pawn on h7. Bishop to d2 by white. And now we play bishop to g4. This is a great move, and we actually have a small advantage already. We're developing our last minor piece, putting it on an active square, and this is putting the question to white, right? Again, trying to make our opponents react to our threats. White's trying to figure out, what do I do here? Most common move and the best move is knight to h4. But now we can start to see how we use these kingside pawns. So if you look at the light squares, white has the queen on c2, bishop on d3, knight on h4. Those pieces control a lot of these squares, right? You see the knight hitting these squares, the diagonal. We can now start to use our pawns to fight on these light squares. Pawn to g6. Super strong move. It shuts out all the plans for this knight. It shuts out the plans for the bishop and the queen. And we have an extra pawn over here. We have 4 pawns in front of our king. That gives us this flexibility to push the pawns and still keep a safe king position. Okay, so let's see what the notes say. White moves their knight to the side of the board. We respond with g6. So this prevents white from jumping to f5. It creates kind of this rock solid position on our king side. And our plan is to play queen to d7, which connects our rooks on the back rank. We're going to play pawn to f5, knight to e6. And we're going to start pushing our king side pawns up the board for the advantage. So it's a minus 0.3 here. We have a 0.3 advantage, 3/10 of a pawn. And we're going to push on the king side for an advantage. Okay, so that's Tartakower, the second chapter, chapter 2 of 2 for the Tartakower. Any questions on the Tartakower specifically before we go into the last line? And now that I'm thinking about it, I think what we'll do for this is we'll put maybe 10 YouTube videos out. Each YouTube video will cover one of these chapters. And then we'll also have a course that's free where each of them is in its own chapter, and we'll have some bonus content. Like you can download the whole PGN. Maybe we'll do a couple quiz questions, things like that. So you can kind of have a more curated course that you can look at on the ChessGoals website. But the plan has always been to make this a free course. I want all this content to stay free for the intro. Yeah, Karpov played the knight to d7 variation. So I see that in the chat. And that's actually following Karpov's games was how I originally got into the Caro-Kann. I would follow Karpov's repertoire, and I liked knight to d7 back then. But my results actually weren't great with knight to d7 as my rating got higher. So I found as I reached about the expert level, I had trouble winning these positions from the black side. I would get a lot of draws against, like, let's say 1800s, or I would overpress an equal position and end up losing some of those games. So I really wasn't in love with the knight to d7 lines once I hit expert level. And that was one of the reasons I stopped playing the Caro for a bit. But now that I've found the Tartakower, I like the classical again. Harsha is saying, what's your rating? I am rated 2200 USCF, so a national master. Okay, Dave says breaking into separate vids is a great idea. Awesome. Because they aren't for winning, Matt. Nice. All right, let's go into the last line. Knight to f3. So we got e4, c6, knight f3. And sometimes you'll find that white just wants a quiet move like knight f3. And you'll find, especially at the beginner level, white has the standard plan. e4, move the knight out, move the bishop out, and castle. They just want to do that the first 4 moves, which makes a lot of sense. And knight f3 is not a bad move here at all. It can actually transpose into multiple variations of the Caro-Kann. So we're going to still play d5, keeping consistent. d5 no matter what, fight for the center. On to e5, and this is similar to what we saw with the advanced variation, but there's a little bit of a difference. There's no pawn on d4 yet, and the knight's out on f3. So we're going to use that to our advantage. We're going to just pin this knight straight away, and most likely, white will play d4. d4, and this is kind of the cool thing with some of these transpositions where white doesn't play d4 early, and the whole Caro-Kann repertoire in general. When white doesn't play d4 early, it's almost always best for them to play d4 later on and to transpose into some of our other lines. And if they don't transpose into some of our other lines, then we get a better version of those lines. So that's one thing I really like about when white delays d4. Their best option is to play d4 anyways, and it usually favors us, or at worst, it's just transposing. So bishop g4, developing the bishop, playing e6 next. d4, most common move. e6. So this looks almost identical to some of our advanced lines, but we got the bishop out earlier, and we haven't played c5 yet. h3. So now here, even though we don't have this kind of c5, c3 tension on the d4 square, It's still clear enough to me that we will get an advantage by trading off the f3 knight. So remember, we only trade on f3 when we think we can convert it into something. We already have enough here to go for that trade. We can already tell it's going into our advanced variation positions where we pressure the d-pawn. Eliminating that knight on f3 will help us pressure the d-pawn. So we're going to take. Queen takes back. And now we play pawn to c5. Again, attacking the base of white's pawn chain. This is the pawn chain. We attack the base. c3 by white. And now you can probably guess the next move. Knight to c6. Second attacker on the d4 pawn. So this pawn attacks, this knight attacks. There's only one defender currently. So this is putting the pressure on white. We are looking, even though we have the black pieces, we should be reacting to what white does. We're looking to play with the initiative. We want to attack, 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 make white react to everything that we're doing. Bishop to b5, pinning our knight. So now there's technically only one attacker and there's one defender. Makes sense for white. You probably can guess what we're going to do next. C takes d4. So because that bishop's out, we're going to take on d4, and then we're going to look to pressure this pawn, which has no pawns to defend it. So for example, you could play queen to b6 here, and that's not a bad move, but we can play a little bit stronger of a move even with knight to e7 first. So knight to e7, defending this knight. And what we're doing here is we're ready to recapture on c6 with the e7 knight. So that's why it's nice to insert knight e7 here, because we want to be ready with that recapture. Castle by white. Here we can play queen to b6. It's a fork, bishop and queen. So bishop takes c6, knight takes c6. Now look what's happened to white again. Double attack, b2, d4. This is classic Caro-Kann advanced variation with c3. White has so much trouble defending both of those pawns. And I've gotten so many quick wins, and I've seen so many quick wins from ChessGoals students that play this repertoire because white just drops a pawn and then they go on to convert. Black goes on to convert. So white can't defend both. Bishop to e3, trying to defend the more important pawn. And again, be careful here. If you go knight takes d4, you really need to remember this. The knight is pinned, and queen to g4 gives white an advantage. Okay, you don't want to be stuck being the one playing defense here. Like rook c1, this is a 1.8 advantage for white. Tactics are going in white's favor. So don't grab this pawn if your knight's going to be pinned and white has queen g4 next. Grab the b2 pawn. Knight to d2 by white. And then here's that move we saw earlier, bishop to b4. This is the calm move that shuts down white's counterplay. The bishop is defended by the knight. So it means a move like rook to b1 is not as strong because that bishop is there blocking the rook. So the best move for white, or the most common move I should say, is knight to b3. And here we castle. So we're a pawn up, fantastic position. And the plan is we're going to utilize this open c file with our rooks, and we're going to push our queenside pawn advantage. So we have two pawns over here to white's one. We're going to push those pawns up the board, use that to play for the win. And that's it. That's our Caro-Kann introduction course. I would appreciate it if you are looking at this course, if you would rate the course and leave a review. And we also have a full in-depth Caro-Kann course with 100 lines if you want to check that out. And we have a Caro-Kann middle games course and a Caro-Kann tactics course. So thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the course. All right, so that's it for the course recording. Let's just open it up now. Any Caro-Kann questions in general? So done with the course stuff. Any general Caro-Kann questions? Or just anything you guys want to talk about? Nice. Looking forward to more Caro content. I like it. We had our Jesse and I had our podcast going for a while. It was called No Pun Intended. We always appreciate the puns. Lee's saying, what is your feeling about d4 c6? Yeah, it's good. If you're a Caro-Kann player and you play, for example, the Slav, C6 is perfectly good. You just have to make sure after C4 that you're fine with the Slav. If you're a Slav and a Caro-Kann player, and I was for many years, start with C6 is perfectly fine. I did that myself even. Yeah, thanks, Dave. I'm glad you enjoyed it. One thing I like about doing the live classes is it forces me to really get everything prepared and get that immediate feedback. Whereas like just recording a course, sometimes I don't get the feedback right away. So it's helpful for me. Okay, still 31 people watching. If you're watching and you don't have any of our courses, check out the Caro-Kann full course. And we also have a Caro-Kann quick start course as well. That's a good one. The website is courses.chessgoals.com. We have a free ChessGoals blueprint on there for study plans. And we also have a Discord server. You purchase, actually, you don't even have to purchase a course anymore. If you purchase a course, you get a certain tag in Discord, unlock some channels, but anyone can join our Discord server. Lee's saying, when will your CK core course come out? So for the introduction course, hopefully this week. I'll just get things figured out, put into the course. But I also have 5 games to add to our Art of Conversion course. So once you purchase a course, you get that course for life. Any additions to the course, you get those updates included. I have 5 games to add to the Art of Conversion course. The videos are already recorded. I just need to go in and add the chapters. Andrew's saying, how would you recommend a beginner start building the repertoire? When do you feel to start playing openings or studying in the games? Ready to start playing them? I think, Andrew, starting small, just getting the main ideas, and then play a ton of games. Use your games to help guide what you learn in the openings and review every game. Just review a game, explore with the engine. What if I did this? What if they do that? If you're following a specific course, go back and look at the recommendations in that line. But I use the games to guide how I study my openings. Thanks, Chess Leveling. Thanks, Dennis. I appreciate it. Arsha's saying, what are the general plans for a Caro-Kann player? It depends on the pawn structure. So there's a lot of different pawn structures in the Caro-Kann. Each pawn structure, you kind of have to get a good feel for those positions. Is the Tartakower like the Berlin defense, just with the crippled majority on the king side instead of the queen side? It's very similar, I would say, yeah. There are some differences, though. I feel like the Berlin is a bit more passive to me. Like black really just sits back and waits for a while, whereas the Tartakower feels a bit more dynamic. But that could just be my own bias because I don't play the Berlin. But I think there are definitely similarities in that black has the weakened pawn structure and has to play actively. I feel like the Berlin, though, it's more like you're comfortable with the draw, whereas the Tartakower, I feel you're still playing to press white. I played the Berlin for a little bit, just testing it out, and I was studying a lot of the lines, and I just found that I felt I was just sitting back and waiting, trying to hold a draw in position a lot of times. Whereas with the Tartakower, I feel I can poke and prod at the opponent's position, get them to create some weaknesses, and then work around those to press for an advantage. Any other questions? Still 30 people watching. Thank you, everybody. Okay, Lee saying I use Caro 90% of the time when I play black. What is your opinion? Yeah, that's good. I think 1e4 for white at the beginner level is so common that you're going to mostly get Caro-Kanns. And then you're going to find the higher your rating goes, the less you'll see e4, even though it's still the most popular move at all levels. But like at my level, I would say I see e4 50% of the time, d4 maybe 40%, and then knight f3, c4, kind of filling out maybe 7 or 8%, and then 2 or 3% the other moves. But at the beginner level, you almost never see knight f3 or c4 on move 1. In d4, you probably see a lot less often than e4. Okay, Chess Simple saying for a player using your Slav and Caro course, which white course gives you the most number of similar pawn structures? It's a good question. I don't think you can get similar pawn structures with any of our current courses. Maybe like the Kali opening would be the closest. But I've really been liking our E4 course. I think it's a great way to push for an advantage below 2200 especially. So I would recommend the E4 course as sort of a go-to course. I'm also a huge fan of the Catalan though. I think the Catalan gives you really solid, consistent positions, super low risk. Like worst case scenario, your positions are equal. Best case scenario, you're just positionally crushing your opponent 15 moves in. And most games end up somewhere in between, where you just get like a nice, comfortable 0.3, 0.4, 0.5 edge. You get space, you get your plans. And I think you have to memorize some of the tactical lines, the sharper lines for black, but a lot of players don't know those, probably below 2000. So that's what I would say. Our 1e4 course or our 1d4 course using the Catalan would be my preferences. Caro does not work against the London because the London is a d4 opening. White doesn't put a pawn on e4, but you could learn the Slav, which is similar. And the Italian, it does work because the Italian is 1e4 and you're going to play c6 and d5. So you're going to get your Caro set up against white when they try to play the Italian. Italian, though, is when you play e5 on move 1. So it technically won't be Italian. But if they go for that setup, you'll still get your Caro. And if you guys sign up for any of the free courses, that'll get you on our email list and you'll get notified of all of the stuff coming up for ChessGoals. Okay, still 34 people watching. Make sure you are subscribed to the channel. Give this video a like. If you want one free course recommendation, it's got to be the ChessGoals Blueprint. This is a 12-week study plan. I'll put a link in the chat. 12-week study plan where every single day it gives you a task. And there's different levels based on your rating. So the plan can be very specific to your rating. You can either print it out or you can create sort of a spreadsheet or a different system for yourself, or just each day you check off that you completed the day. But the thing with ChessGoals is we're data-driven. We try to make things efficient for adult improvers, especially busy adults. I want to take the guesswork out of how to study. Just focus on going through the process, boom, boom, boom. Enjoy the game. Don't stress about, should I do this? Should I do that? Am I gaining rating? Am I not gaining rating? Just focus on the process. You're going to be improving along the way. And the rating is going to be a lagging indicator of your progress. As long as you're improving, that rating will eventually go up. And the Blueprint course will just keep you focused. And a lot of people don't know this because it's been a few years now, but the Blueprint course was actually started based on this huge survey that I ran. I think I did the survey in 2020. It was like during the pandemic. And over 400 people took the survey. I think it was around 450 players. And what I did was I asked people each week on average, how much time do you spend on blank? And the blanks were blitz, rapid, classical, analyzing your games, doing tactics, doing strategy work, doing endgame work. I walked through all the different aspects of chess playing and training and asked people to estimate. So it's just survey data. It's only as good as the responses, but I think on average with enough people, it's pretty good. I asked them all those questions about how they studied, what's their rating, what's their age, and what was their rating a year ago. And then I was able to map that data to figure out what's the most efficient study plans based on your rating and how much time you have. I also asked the total hours a week spent to improve as quickly as possible. So that's what sort of formed the eventual ChessGoals blueprint, is these study plans are based on data, how people improved the most efficient way. And my background is in statistics. So I kind of enjoy this merging of data, stats, and chess. So that's where the ChessGoals blueprint came from originally. Arsha's saying, where can I watch a full video on the Caro? Do you want a full course on the Caro, Harsha? I can show you our ChessGoals Caro-Kann course. And you can do a free preview of it. So there's a couple full, like 45-minute videos on some of the lines that you can watch in the free preview. But that's our full course. It's about 100 lines of the Caro-Kann. It has quizzes, downloadable PGN, some bonus files, all included. 30-day money-back guarantee. If you don't like the course, just let me know. We'll refund you. But that's our best-selling individual course, and that was our original course. That was our very first course. And then we just keep adding to it. And then we have a ton of Caro-Kann content on, I can't say content now without thinking Caro-Kann, on the YouTube channel as well. Any other questions before we wrap up? Still 32 people watching. Thanks everyone for coming today. And we will probably do another class next weekend. The weekend coming up. Actually, let's do a poll right now. I can figure out how to do it. So if we do a live class next weekend, it would either be October 4th or 5th, and probably at the same time. So would you rather do Saturday, Sunday, there we go. I have to cover all options. Would you rather do Saturday, Sunday, either, or neither? Vote on the poll, and then we can just check the answers. Papa, you'll have to watch the replay. Yeah, we went through 10 lines of the Caro. Introduction. It's a tie right now, Saturday and Sunday. 33% each. 3 votes each. Still a tie. Still a tie. 4 votes each. Okay, and for the next class, would you guys like to do more Caro-Kann? Like, do you want to do Caro-Kann pawn structures? Or should we do an intro to the dynamic Slav course? So then you would have a full repertoire against e4, the Caro, and any other first moves with the dynamic Slav, specifically d4. More Caro, or should we do a new intro? We could do an intro on the dynamic Slav, get you guys ready for anything. Flip a coin, Caro. I'm assuming flip a coin for the day of the next live class. Okay, Slav, Slav, Slav. All right. That works for me. I've actually already started my notes on the Slav intro course. I don't know how it's possible, but these votes are staying tied for Saturday and Sunday. So either day works, it looks like. I think historically, Sunday mornings have worked better, but today's attendance was actually really good for a Saturday. So maybe kind of going into this fall season, Saturdays are working just as well. I think in the summers, Saturdays have underperformed just in terms of the number of people coming. Okay, it looks like Sunday is ahead by 1 vote. So stay tuned to your emails. I'll be announcing it this week. I think most likely we will do Sunday. I'm leaning towards Sunday slightly. So tentatively mark your calendars, Sunday, October 5th, 10 a.m. And we will plan on doing the dynamic Slav intro. Okay, any other questions before we wrap up? This was awesome. Thanks everyone for coming. I wasn't sure, how the turnout would be. It's a different type of class. But I'm excited to get more people into the Caro-Kann. I'm going to chop this course or this class up into 10 videos for YouTube. Then I'll make a free Thinkific course on our website. Thinkific is just our course player. And that free course will have downloadable file, and I'll add some bonus content as well. Probably just some simple quiz questions. All right. Thanks, everybody. I will talk to you later. Have a good rest of your day. Thanks for watching.